Barefoot in a blizzard, she carried water for her family every day until one rancher changed everything. The water was ice. That was the first thing Margaret Thorne understood every morning when her feet found the creek. Not cold, ice, a living thing that bit and held on. The blizzard had stopped sometime in the night, but the wind had kept moving, sculpting the snow into drifts that reached the windowsill of the cabin. Maggie stood in the shallow current with her boots tied around her neck by their laces. She couldn't afford to soak her only pair and let the numbness climb from her ankles to her knees. The yoke across her shoulders was oak, smoothed by her father's hands 20 years ago, and it had worn a permanent red mark into her skin that never quite healed between trips. One more. Mama. Eliza stood on the bank in boots that had been Ezekiel's, stuffed with rags, watching her mother with the particular stillness of a child who had stopped being a child some time ago. 10 years old, old enough to understand that the water line on the buckets had to reach the second rivet or there wouldn't be enough for porridge and washing in the cloths on Ruth's forehead. Maggie filled the second bucket. The weight came down on her shoulders like a judgment. She waded out, her bare feet finding the stones by memory, and Eliza took the smaller pail from her without being asked. They walked back toward the cabin in a silence that had become their native language. Inside, the fire was down to embers. Thomas, 6, sat on the floor with Ruth in his lap, trying to keep her warm. The baby was 18 months old and she had the fever, not the shaking kind, the quiet kind, where the skin burned and the eyes stayed half open and nothing made her cry or laugh. 3 days now. 3 days since Dr. Morley had come, looked at the empty tin on the shelf where payment should have been, and left without opening his bag. "She's the same," Thomas whispered. Maggie set down the yoke. Her feet were blue-white at the toes, and she ignored them the way you ignore a fact that cannot be changed. She touched Ruth's forehead. The heat was wrong. It was the kind of heat that took children in frontier winters, the kind that had taken Ezekiel 18 months ago when the fever came and the money ran out and the world stayed silent. She looked at her children. 3 of them. 3 reasons she had not yet lain down in the snow and let the cold finish what it kept trying to start. If the sight of a mother destroying herself slowly to keep her babies alive moves something in you, stay with this story. Watch it through to the end. These are the stories we tell so the forgetting doesn't win. Subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one. 18 months earlier, Ezekiel Thorne had been a man who laughed at blizzards. He was not a large man, but he had large hands and a way of looking at marginal land that made it feel like a promise. He'd filed the homestead claim in 1880, 160 acres of Montana range that the surveyor called adequate and Ezekiel called ours. They built the cabin together, felling the pines in September, chinking the walls with mud and moss before the first freeze. Maggie was pregnant with Ruth. Eliza was 8 and still laughed then, a sound like breaking glass in the best way. Thomas was 4 and underfoot. The crop failed in the summer of 1882. Not through any fault of Ezekiel's. The frost came in August, 3 weeks early, and turned the wheat black. He borrowed from Cyrus Hackett at the Dry Creek Mercantile. Seed, tools, a line of credit against the harvest that never came. The note was for $80, which was more than Maggie had seen in one place in her life. But Ezekiel signed it with the confidence of a man who believed in next years. The fever took him in April of 1883. Spring fever, they called it, though it killed like winter. He lasted 6 days. On the 5th day, he took Maggie's hand and said, "I failed you," which was the only lie he ever told her, and the one she could not forgive him for because it meant he died believing it. She sold the horse to pay for the coffin. She sold the good quilt to pay Dr. Morley. She sold her wedding ring to buy the willow bark and laudanum that didn't save him. She sold her boots, stout leather, her mother's gift, to buy the medicine for Ruth's cough that winter. The boots went to Hackett's wife, who wore them to church without acknowledging where they came from. The cabin became hers by widow's right, but the land, Hackett said, was collateral. The note had not been paid. The interest had compounded. She owed $147 and some cents, a figure so large it might as well have been the distance to the moon. The town of Dry Creek did what towns do. They watched. They discussed her situation over coffee and agreed that something ought to be done. Mrs. Peabody, the blacksmith's wife, made a point of crossing the street when she saw Maggie coming, as if poverty were a contagion you could catch through eye contact. The minister prayed for her from the pulpit but did not visit. The world stayed silent. The morning Silas Cole first saw her, the temperature had dropped to 6 below. He was riding the fence line on the north quarter, checking for breaks where the elk had pressed through, when he saw the smoke from the Thorne homestead. Thin smoke, desperate smoke, the kind that comes from green wood and hope burning at the same time. He turned the gray horse toward it. He found her at the creek. She did not hear him approach. The wind covered the sound of hooves. He sat the horse at 30 yards and watched a woman in a dress that was more patches than fabric lower herself into freezing water with a wooden yoke across her shoulders. A girl stood guard on the bank, holding a smaller pail, her face closed like a fist. Silas looked at the woman's feet. Bare, red, the color of meat left too long in the snow. He had not spoken to another human being in 3 days. His ranch was 12 miles north, and he preferred the company of cattle, who did not remind him of what he had lost. But he sat there and felt something shift in his chest, some long sealed door creaking on its hinges, not all the way, but enough to let in light. He rode down to the bank. The girl saw him first. She stepped between the horse and her mother, dropping the pail, her hands coming up in a gesture that was not quite surrender and not quite threat. Maggie straightened under the yoke, water streaming from the buckets, and looked at him with eyes that had stopped expecting anything good from men on horseback. "Sir," she said, not welcoming, not afraid. The voice of someone who had used up her fear and was running on something harder. "Ma'am." Silas dismounted. He moved the way men who work with horses move, no sudden weight, no threat in the motion. "I have a ham in my saddlebag. My smokehouse produced more than I need this winter." "We don't take charity," Eliza said. The words came out flat, rehearsed, a child's mouth speaking an adult's wound. "I wasn't offering charity," Silas said. He looked at Maggie, not the child. "I was offering to carry those buckets to your door. They're heavy." Maggie looked at him, at the horse, at the ham she could smell from the saddlebag, a scent like another planet, like memory. "We're managing," she said. "I'm sure you are." Silas stepped forward. He did not reach for the yoke. He waited. "But the wind's picking up, and that baby inside doesn't sound like she's breathing right. Let me carry the water. You can refuse the ham at the door." Maggie's hand stilled on the yoke. She looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at the stranger with the gray eyes and the scar through his eyebrow and the hands that hung empty at his sides. "One trip," Maggie said. Silas lifted the yoke. The weight of it surprised him, not because it was heavy, but because it was exactly the weight a woman her size should not have been able to carry twice a day, every day, in water that stole the feeling from her feet. He walked to the cabin. Maggie followed, barefoot in the snow, and did not let herself feel anything about the fact that someone else was carrying her burden, because feeling it would mean wanting it, and wanting things you couldn't keep was a cruelty she'd already learned to avoid. He set the yoke inside. The cabin was one room, a table, 3 chairs, a bed, a cradle. The woodpile was 3 logs high. The shelves were empty except for a tin of cornmeal and a jar of rendered fat. Ruth lay in the cradle, her breathing thin and fast. Silas took the ham from his bag and set it on the table. "I can't pay," Maggie said. "I didn't ask for payment." He looked at Ruth, at the fire that was eating its last log, at the children's faces, which were the color of paper left in the rain. "My name is Silas Cole. I have a ranch 12 miles north. If you need wood, I'll bring wood. If you need food, I'll bring food. I won't ask for anything in return." "Why?" Maggie asked. The question came out sharp, suspicious, the only kind of question she had left. Silas looked at Ruth. He looked at the cradle. Something moved in his face, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than before. "My wife died 5 years ago," he said. "The baby, too. I couldn't stop the bleeding. I tried." He paused. "Some things just ask to be answered." He left before she could refuse him again. One night, Maggie told herself, she would let him help for one night. He returned the next morning with a sled of split pine. He stacked it by the door without asking to come in. He returned the morning after that with cornmeal, salt pork, and a bottle of tonic from the mercantile that the doctor had recommended for fevers. Maggie accepted the wood. She accepted the cornmeal. She would not accept the tonic until Eliza looked at her and said, "Ruth needs it," in the voice of a child who had already buried one parent and was not going to watch a sister follow. They shared a meal on the third day. Maggie made cornmeal porridge with the salt pork cut small. It was the first meat the children had tasted in a month. Thomas ate with the total focus of a boy who had forgotten what fullness felt like. Eliza ate half and put half in her pocket when she thought no one was looking. Silas saw. He said nothing. "My husband's name was Ezekiel," Maggie said. The fire was high. The room was warm for the first time in weeks. "He died believing he'd failed us. He didn't. The frost failed him. Hackett failed him. But he died thinking it was his fault, and I can't seem to prove otherwise." Silas sat with his bowl in both hands, the way a man holds something he doesn't want to lose. "My wife's name was Clara," he said. "She was 37. The baby was Breech. The doctor was drunk. I had $12 in my pocket and I couldn't make him sober." He looked at the fire. "I built the crib myself. It's still in the back room, empty." Maggie looked at him. The silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of two people who understood that grief was not a competition, but a geography, and they had both been living in the same country for years without knowing the other was there. Eliza watched them from the corner. She was mending Thomas's coat with thread she'd unraveled from her own hem. She looked at Silas, then at Ruth in the cradle, then back at Silas. "If he can make Ruth laugh," she said to her mother, not looking up from her needle, "I'll believe he's different. Ruth hasn't smiled since Papa died. Not once. If he can make her smile, I'll believe he means it." Maggie opened her mouth to hush her daughter, but Silas raised his hand. Not a gesture of authority, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Fair enough," he said. The thaw came early that week, and with it the sound of wagon wheels. Cyrus Hackett did not travel in mud if he could avoid it, but he made an exception for collections. He arrived in a black sleigh with brass fittings driven by a man with no expression. Hackett was 50, soft in the way that men who have never done physical labor become soft, with a smile that showed too many teeth and eyes that showed none. Maggie met him on the porch. She had not had time to put her boots on. She was barefoot out of necessity now, the soles of her feet hard as leather but cracked at the heels, and she stood in the slush with her arms crossed. "Mrs. Thorne," Hackett said, "I regret to inform you that your husband's note is in default. The full amount is now due, $147.32. "I don't have it," Maggie said. "I'm aware. The law, however, is not interested in what you have. It is interested in what you owe. I have filed with this territorial court. This homestead is collateral. You have until Friday to vacate, or I will take possession." Maggie felt the words settle into her like stones finding the bottom of a well. Friday. 3 days. "Where would we go?" she asked. "The county has arrangements for indigent children. An orphanage in Helena. The girl is old enough for domestic service. The boy—" Hackett shrugged. "Someone will take him." Maggie's hands curled into fists. The pain from her cracked heels was distant, unimportant. "You can't take my children," she said. "I don't want to, Mrs. Thorne. I want my money. But if I can't have my money, I'll have the land. And if you have no land, you have no claim to keep minors in a structure you do not own." He leaned forward. "I see you've had visitors. A man from the North Range. Perhaps you found alternative arrangements. Some women do." Maggie did not hit him. She wanted to. The restraint cost her something visible. Her jaw tightened until she thought her teeth might crack. "Get off my property," she said. Hackett smiled. "Friday, Mrs. Thorne. You have until Friday." The blizzard arrived on Wednesday. Before we continue the story, I just want to say something from the heart. These videos take a lot more time, effort, and money to make than most people realize. Sometimes I spend days, even weeks, creating a single story, writing it, editing it, building the visuals, and trying to make it feel like something real instead of just another video. Over the last few months, I've been trying something that means a lot to me personally. Instead of using random images, I've been working hard to make the visuals actually match the story. The same faces, the same characters, the right ages, the right emotions, the right moments. I know it's still not perfect, but I absolutely loved seeing so many of you notice it and mention it in the comments. And just to be clear, I'm not saying I'm better than other creators. Not at all. I've learned a lot from the creators in this niche, and I have a great deal of respect for them. I simply wanted to push myself a little further and see how immersive these stories could become if the visuals matched the storytelling as closely as possible. The truth is, I'm still working every day to improve it, and I'm doing all of this alone. For more than 5 months, I've spent countless hours and my own money on tools and software trying to make these stories better. Then, after finally getting monetized, YouTube demonetized the channel right before payout. So after all this time, all this effort, and all this investment, I still haven't earned a penny. Honestly, that's been hard. But I genuinely believe these stories can become something special, and I want to keep improving them for you. That's why I uploaded the next part of this story on both Rumble and Dailymotion. The links are in the pinned comment and description. You can watch on whichever platform is easier for you, if you've enjoyed what I'm trying to build here. Please consider supporting the story there. Every view helps more than you know. It helps me continue improving the visuals, improving the stories, and pushing toward the level of quality that I know these stories can reach. And if this approach succeeds, maybe it encourages more creators to spend extra time making their visuals and storytelling even better too. At the end of the day, that's a win for everyone who loves this kind of content. Thank you for being here, and thank you to everyone who's noticed the effort behind these stories. Now, if you're ready, the next part is waiting for you.